Having a rough go of it there, are you?
A bit.
Well, why didn't you just take it out of your pouch?
They're full of other stuff.
Well, like what?
Grenades, brain mags.
Bren mags? What's a Bren mag?
It's a light machine gun.
The Bren light machine gun?
Yes, the Bren light machine gun.
Never heard of it. All I know, it's this rifle and me that's important.
Well, times have changed a bit, mate. Oh, well, why don't you get with your rifle there, get with the program, give me some covering fire so I can get these over there.
Okay.
Right.
By the close of the Great War, the armies of the Empire stood in marked contrast to those that had marched to war in 1914. New weapons, and the tactics to go with them, had transformed the way battle was prosecuted. Despite this, personal kit, namely the 1908 Patton web equipment, underwent surprisingly little change. As new weapons and tactics evolved, pouches and accessories made for those weapons were simply added to the set, or merely slung about the body. This was the most effective way to get these other bits and pieces into service in a wartime economy. The war had left the Empire in a state of severe financial stress, and there was simply no room for the development and issue of new equipment, especially as remaining stocks of the 1908 Patton web equipment remained so high and so available to a post-war shrinking army. Now, notwithstanding the trial of various types of equipment during the 1920s and 30s, it would take the threat of yet another world war for a new set of equipment to be designed and issued. Approved in 1937, a new pattern of equipment was issued in ever-increasing numbers right up to the beginning of the Second World War. The 1937 Patton web equipment borrowed manufacturing techniques of the earlier set, but perhaps its most salient feature was its accommodation for the ammunition of various types of new weapons then coming into service. This took the form of a complete redesign in the techniques used to carry the ammunition for these new weapons. Recently, Mike from Bloke on the Range visited my part of the world, and we took the opportunity to discuss some of the differences between the 1908 and the 1937 Patton web equipment, as well as some of the tactical considerations that drove the change.
Hello and welcome to Bloke on the British Muzzleloaders Range. I'm here with Rob in Western Canada. Very happy to be here. Very grateful for him hosting me to talk about areas of mutual interest.
There might be one or two.
A couple, somewhere along the line. Right, what we're going to talk about today, as that little sketch might have indicated, is the difference in kit from the 1908 Patton to the 1937 Patton and the philosophy around that and how it developed over time and why. Now, Rob, do you want to take us quickly through the salient points of your 08 Patton gear?
There's a number of points that come to mind. The first off is its construction. It's made out of cotton webbing, which is the first of its kind in British and Empire service as far as a full set of equipment goes. Secondly, it's intended for the exclusive use of chargers in relation to the SMLE. These in total of 10 small pouches hold a maximum of 150 rounds, although as we've discussed amongst ourselves, the actual battle load or the actual textbook load was 120. The others, perhaps as far as ergonomics go, is that this is a one-piece set of equipment that by undoing the belt buckle and perhaps the shoulder straps here to let the braces through, I can take this on and off like a coat. It's an extremely efficient design in terms of the way it carries all of its components together. And in that sense, it ends up being the most advanced set of personal equipment leading into the Great War.
And indeed, it lasted until just before the Second World War broke out, and probably in territorial service even a little beyond that. Now, I'm wearing a 37 Patton equipment. I'm dressed and equipped as for sort of late war-ish, 1944, 1945. And the obvious thing you'll notice is I've got nowhere to put my rifle ammunition. That's the big, serious change. I mean, these pouches are huge, and if I was to drop rifle ammunition in there, I would struggle to get down and get at it. It will fall out the chargers because they're not the most stable things. I mean, these are well-designed, well-sized pouches that keep the chargers together, stop the ammunition getting out of order, and so on. The big change that drove this has nothing to do with the rifle per se. This is a set of equipment which is based around the Bren gun, because when this was adopted, there was no such thing as a light machine gun in British infantry use. Everything was focused around the rifle. Here, these pouches are sized for Bren guns, Bren gun mags. Now, late war, I would have been carrying in the left pouch 2 Bren gun mags with 28 rounds each, because they short loaded them. They will hold 30, but they found it was more reliable if they only held 28, which are for the section Bren gun. I would be carrying, if issued, 1 or more grenades in here, which you can get at fairly easily. I would be carrying 50 rounds in a bandolier folded up in there. I've only got one bandolier with me, unfortunately. And another bandolier slung round for my own rifle. So I'm actually carrying far more ammunition for the Bren than for my own rifle. This second bandolier in here is not for me, it's for the gun. It's for refilling Bren mags. It was different early war. You'd find people carrying 3 mags, but always 50 rounds for the rifle. And the rifle had been reduced in significance from something where you're carrying 120 rounds on paper to something where you're carrying 50 rounds on paper, because everything revolved around the Bren gun, contrary to popular myth. There's a myth that goes around that the Second World War German infantry section was
Well, it was machine gun centric.
Yeah.
That everything revolved around the machine, the GP, well, what effectively was a GPMG in the light roll, the MG34 or the MG42.
And according to myth, the British doctrine was that the machine gun supported the rifleman, whereas the Germans it was the other way around, which unfortunately is actually not true. And it's clear from doctrine, from the pamphlets and from what happened on the ground, that in fact the Bren was the section's main firepower. Everyone was to be trained in its use, and everyone was carrying ammunition for it. Unlike the Germans, had basically 3 guys who were carrying the gun and operating the gun, and carrying most, if not all, of the ammunition. If there was extra ammunition above their allocation, that would be spread around, but they had no way to carry it. And remember, you don't actually. Everyone's seen Vietnam films with belts all around the shoulders, but you actually don't want to do that as far as possible. So carrying extra belted ammunition for the universal machine gun in German service meant carrying it in your hand, because they didn't have pouches. Here, you've got typically a gun group is 3 men, the guy operating it, the section 2 in command, and the number 2 on the gun. And what the number 2 on the gun's job is to run around with a pair of these, which are called utility pouches, getting full mags from members of the rifle group, which depending on the size of the section is basically everyone who's not in the gun group. It would typically be 5 to 7 men. Now he would be shifting full mags from the guy's pouches to the gun and empty mags back, and then they'd be being refilled. Now, as our little vignette showed, these bandoliers are a bit crappy, but I suspect that that the idea was most of the time you would be hoping that there was a convenient point to reload, because honestly with these tabs and everything, they are a bit of a pain in the backside. You do have 10 rounds up though, so your need to put in another charger is slightly reduced.
The fact that the ammunition is intended to be carried from the bandolier, I think also speaks to the emphasis on the Bren gun.
Yep.
In that the individual man with 150, or I mean even up to 250 rounds of rifle ammunition carried in some operations during the First World War, to the fact that you're relying on a bandolier 50 rounds as a rifleman also indicates the importance of the Bren gun. Because it is the weapon that perpetuates the fight, not the rifleman. as we find in the early part, anyway, of the Great War.
Yeah.
That the rifleman is the only thing, essentially, apart from, notwithstanding artillery, but it's the rifleman that fights and wins the battle. Whereas we get through the Great War and into the Second World War, and it is the light machine guns. It's much more of a wide panoply of weaponry that allows that rifleman to get where he needs to be, i.e. onto the enemy position.
And when the Lewis gun was adopted, Lewis gun, for those who don't know, have these 47 round drums. He's got nowhere to put it as a rifleman. You couldn't slap one on, he'll land on it, he'll break it, the ammo will go everywhere. So they had to have dedicated people their job was, like the Germans in the Second World War, to carry ammunition. You've studied how the Lewis sections in World War I went, and would you mind giving a brief summary?
Well, certainly. The beginning of the Great War, a platoon is a very homogeneous grouping of 4 sections of all riflemen. Through the middle of the Great War, we see the introduction of the Lewis gun, first at battalion, then down to company level. But ultimately, in early 1917, there's a document entitled SS 143, which is a training pamphlet, which outlines the very beginnings of platoon level tactics and doctrine. And what we see is the Lewis gun being devolved down to the platoon level. Individual sections within the platoon are given separate roles. One of which, of course, is that Lewis gun section. And that Lewis gun section, its primary role is to man, operate, and protect the Lewis gun as it itself supports the platoon as it operates. Other sections include the rifle grenade section, the bomb section, and the rifle section as a group of just straight riflemen. But in that, we have, much like you described the German section, or the group, I believe they called it, in that the ammunition for its light machine gun was carried by a bunch of other people in cans, in hands.
Backpacks.
Exactly. As a way to organically support the section. The Lewis gun in the Great War, it hasn't got machine gun tactics, smaller unit tactics haven't quite arrived there yet. And the platoon, with its various types of sections, each providing its own support within that platoon battle, that is the level at which the machine gun is used. So we have, I don't say the luxury, but the Lewis gun needs a lot of ammunition carried in awkward magazines. It needs a lot of spare parts. It needs a lot of people to support it. So the Lewis gun, if we were to move forward, the Lewis gun would not be a good section weapon because too many men would be required to operate it and keep it in the fight at that level. You'd have a gun group of 6 or 7 and a rifle group of 3.
Yeah, which doesn't make any sense at all.
So it's interesting, though, tracing that evolution of machine guns, especially as they progress through the Great War, down beyond into the Second World War, and the tactical level at which they're employed gets lower and lower and lower and lower.
And as I mentioned, everyone was trained in the use of the brain gun as a section weapon. There were special people trained more. There was a brain gun proficiency badge that could be awarded, and that was more for sort of advanced use of the tripod for firing on fixed lines, anti-aircraft roles, and things like that. And as an interesting aside, there's something that comes up in American lessons learned documents over and over and over again, is that every man should have been trained on the BAR, which they weren't doing. And there's some lessons learned documents in the Second World War saying, look, if there's only one man left standing, he's got the BAR, provided it's still running, which they weren't always. But even as late as Korea, they were saying everyone should be trained on the BAR. It was sort of treated, it was an automatic rifle rather than a light machine gun. It was treated almost like an individual, so as a specialist weapon, whereas the Bren was everybody was trained in its use. And it's actually the Germans trained everyone in the light machine gun role, so that if the gunner got hit, they could just shift up and pick up. And and this is entirely reflected in all the gear. This is actually just a bit of I'm unhooked.
Maybe sort of the apart from the philosophy behind it in the universal pouches, intended to carry the Bren gun mags and everything. But there's also some differences between the 37 pattern and the 1908 pattern that aren't necessarily revolving around specific magazines. Maybe talk a little bit about what those differences might be.
Okay, well, it's quite a modular system. These pouches can be replaced by cartridge carriers, which are basically pretty much these pouches on a hanger to fit on this kit. 20 rounds per side, which was for non-infantry armed with the rifle. So guys operating the 3-inch mortar, Vickers machine gun crews and so on, who had a rifle. Their primary role was doing something else, and they had no need to carry Bren pouches. Round the back, it's all cross straps and various. We got a entrenching tool cover there, late war one. Then it's all hung off. You see various configurations being worn at various times. You got a small pack or haversack that is on the top that can be attached down the side like this, and then a large pack put on these shoulder straps and hooked up. And what's interesting for balance, and this isn't fully loaded, this kit, but effectively the weight of grenades and ammunition in here should be balanced by the weight of mess tins, eating kit, food in the back. It's for its era, it's a fairly clever universal system, whereas the German stuff was quite simple, based around sort of First World War tech, and the Swiss were the same.
Not to mention the fact that it was made of leather.
Leather, yeah. The French were similar. This is actually kind of combined system thinking in the equipment, which also goes into the uniform that goes with it. I mean, these are a short, they call them a blouse for some reason. They're a very short little tunic to save material. Service dress goes all the way down to the thigh, so it's meant to be cheaper. It's kind of baggy in the legs, apparently based around ski suits of the era, which we will of course have to try when weather permits. And I think that's about it.
One point I might interject with, back to the bandolier, the amount of ammunition carried for the individual. It's also important to realize that coming into the era in which World War II lands, there's a philosophy change in the Army, and in one word, that is mechanization. That the BEF at the beginning of the war was highly mechanized, if not nearly completely, by either armored vehicles or trucks. The BEF that marched into France in 1940 was such an organization. And having that level of mechanization inherent down to a low level within the Army in general also allows for the carriage or the more immediate having of ammunition close at hand on a mobile platform, whether it be a Bren carrier or a truck of some sort. So it was thought anyway that the necessity simply to have 150 rounds on you simply wasn't there, because chances are in any given action you wouldn't go through that much. You would fight an action with your 50 or some degree of rounds around that number, but then you could easily, the trucks or the Bren carriers would come up and deliver you more, even under fire, because they were armored. Whereas that luxury didn't exist during the Great War, and it was a question of, if the ammunition had to get to you, it had to be carried by either manpower or animal power. So the philosophy, as you discuss, it was also highly based on the mechanization that was intended the Army to have.
And actually, there's another point. It's reflected in the position of the basic pouches here. They're mounted kind of high on the belt. The first Patton were mounted a couple of inches lower, but it was difficult to sit in a vehicle with them because they wore them quite round the front. And actually, another point is that due to shortages of webbing at the start of World War II, they made basic pouches to fit 08 Patton, and they made a leather version of this called 39 Patton, which, unlike 14 Patton in the First World War, was not used in combat by British troops to anyone's knowledge at the moment, but other Allied forces, Free French, Free Dutch forces, have been seen using it. But it's exactly the same stuff made in leather, and I believe they actually put it together in something like 24 hours when asked. They just basically copied it in leather making tech. One final point regarding allocation of ammo between rifle and Bren. There's in some of the pamphlets it mentions that the ammunition allocated for the rifle can also be used for refilling Bren mags if required. I mean, this is how much the Bren was more important than the rifle in the doctrine, which really puts lie to this
Absolutely.
to this myth.
When you look at the tactics, as you mentioned, you look at the information available, it becomes very clear that it is in fact a myth.
Yep.
That in British and Empire/Commonwealth armies, that the Bren gun was ancillary to the rifleman or the rifle group. That was the emphasis, and the Bren gun was a facilitator, which it was indeed. But it's clear that everything that the individual rifleman is doing and carrying in some way, shape, or form will ultimately support and feed and keep the Bren in action.
And I suspect that a section in a tight spot who've got 30 rounds remaining, it's probably going to be in one Bren mag.
Sure.
And the rifles are going to be hoping not to need them. So, hope that was at least vaguely interesting. Thanks so much, Rob, for the discussion and for hosting me here in Switzerland. If you're not aware of Rob, how could you not be aware of Rob, of British muzzleloaders, if you're watching Bloke on the Range? It's just the depth and detail he goes into in, there's no one else doing anything like that.
There's one other man doing that.
Not in this detail though. And Rob is also, he's the only person that could have got me dressed up fully. So thank you very much to my patrons who have helped fund this. Thank you very much to the Worksworth Gun Room in the UK, who was very helpful and generous in respect of the most of the equipment here. And Rob has Patreons as well. So if you don't already support him on Patreon, please consider doing so. And see you again sometime. Bye.
Bye.
Mags.
What?
Magazines. Give me magazines.
I don't have any magazines.
Everybody's supposed to be carrying magazines.
No, nobody has magazines. It's all online now.
Look, Bren magazines. Bren gun mags.
Why didn't you say so?
Thought it was obvious.
Here. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below.